The Rise of Feminism. Quote, "Feminism was going to right all the wrongs, level the playing field, and be fair to women. Women would be able to do what they wanted, have sex with whom they wanted, and discard unwanted marriages, or end them after they had served their purpose. Women would be free to explore their sexuality and leave a bad marriage to find themselves. Women, above all, would be free to follow their heart and be true to herself, because they needed something for themselves before they could share it with a man. Women presumed men would simply absorb all the changes, adjust to them, and yet continue on as they did before, working to provide, creating and making women's lives easier. Women writing on the topic have said as much. They expected hot alpha studs to service their sexual needs. They expected all the other men to wait for marriage or marry less attractive women. They demanded good, attractive men to be available when they decided they had had enough of the carousel and wanted to marry. They expected to be able to have sex with whom they wanted, when they wanted, and never be judged for it. They expected men to subsidize their lifestyles, and they have, with all sorts of welfare programs. All this was done by appealing to emotion and fairness, because it's for the children. And if you don't support this, you're a sexist pig. Now, people stand around blickered and scratching their heads, genuinely puzzled that men at large in our society are either sackless omegas, inveterate slackers, productive men absolutely refusing to marry or sire children douchebags like the situation, or smooth PUAs bedding women and living at a bare minimum of productivity. They wonder why a growing number of divorced men absolutely refuse remarriage. Simply, it's all about incentives. Incentives matter. Feminism has incentivized all the behaviors we see in men. Detty. There has always been a feminist movement in this culture, although it hasn't often gone by that name. Women have frequently organized to present a counterpoint to male leadership and press strongly for both more women in positions of power and in specific policy issues that were, to the women of the time, uniquely feminine interests. There were the women who fought to eliminate the slave trade, who fought for abolition, who fought for women's suffrage, who fought for prohibition. Throughout American history, women have used their communal power to bring great changes to the course of history. When the slaves were freed, an alcoholic spirit more tightly regulated, and women had the right to vote, World War II came along and women were drafted into the factories and farms needed for industrialized warfare. That demonstrated that they had economic power as well as social power. And after the war, it was inevitable that they'd flex those newfound muscle in the booming post-war economy. An economy driven in large part by consumer spending, and women make 70% of the buying decisions. It was only natural that a push towards equal rights for women in the workplace would occur, and it was needed. Women had demonstrated their talents and ability to perform under pressure in most male-dominated fields, and denying them the right to practice their trade for a fair wage was essentially un-American. Further, the culture of American business had to change to accommodate the new dual-gender constituency. But what was gained by the inclusion and adoption of women in the marketplace was certainly worth the challenges. We'd bombed every competitor's factory on the planet, while ours were untouched, and our victorious position had allowed us to graciously loan money to our defeated foes so that they could buy more stuff from us. We needed women in the workforce just to manage the massive bureaucracy the post-war era demanded, not to mention increasing our industrial capacity at a critical time. Ensuring that company whore was not an unofficial part of a job description was just as important. Feminism boldly pushed for new laws and regulation, and they got them. It pushed for society to honor and respect women for their accomplishments, not just their beauty or their birthright. They wanted to be able to escape a bad domestic situation, and they wanted greater freedom to pursue careers that had been heretofore male only. All of them noble and perfectly reasonable goals. In its way, feminism, women's liberation at the time, was just as essential to the development of the American workplace and American society at large as the trade union movement was to American industry. My grandfather was a staunch Reagan Republican, but when I asked him about doing away with the UAW, he was horrified. Ronald Reagan himself is the only president we've ever had who was a former labor union leader. Unions might be Marxist in flavor, but they helped a hell of a lot of people at an important time. Feminism's goals were noble and pure when they were trying to ensure that a woman did the same work as a man, got paid the same amount, and didn't have to fuck her boss to get any paycheck on time. But somewhere along the line, things started going wonky with feminism. In their quest for equal rights for women, and in their attempt to call attention to the horrific plight of some women, feminism did our culture the dual disservice of reducing the perceived importance of strong male models and attacking masculinity itself. That led to the general and accepted undermining of respect for the American male in both popular culture and interpersonal relationship. The Manosphere argues that that was a bad thing, not just for dudes, but for everyone. Feminism represented a powerful bitch slap to men on several fronts, one from which we are still recovering. And while we've largely adjusted to the hows and whys of working with women on an equal footing in the workplace, in the realms of sex and relationships and marriage as a group, we are as clueless now as we were 20 years ago. There are a lot of ways you can slice it, but everyone makes the same point. As good as feminism has been for women, for men it has been a net negative. Because feminism didn't stop with equal pay laws and the nuts and bolts of sexual harassment, heady with its own successful challenge of long-held beliefs that women can't be doctors, lawyers, or entrepreneurs, feminism went on to attack the status quo marriage brutally. Especially the role of the father. You can't have a patriarchy without a father. Feminism has always been about destroying the influence of the patriarchy, the term used to denote a culture led and influenced exclusively by the fathers, men. A hallmark of the agricultural age, the patriarchy was the basis of Western civilization in a lot of important ways. The patriarchy was the civilizing force that brought order and wheat to people, and that led to a lot more people. The patriarchy resulted from the need to track land ownership through inheritance, where the fathers, the heads of state, or town, village, or household, directed the planting, harvesting, and storage of crops and saw their defense, while the patriarchy and the agricultural revolution brought vitally needed food security to the people, allowing populations to explode, standards of living to rise, and lifespans to increase. The unfortunate fact was that life was pretty brutal for women. In many ways, the entire civilization rested on their backs. Apart from longer and better lives, their lot still pretty much sucked. Land wars took their husbands and sons into wars of religion and politics. Disease and malnutrition took their children, those who survived birth. They had little or no say in how they lived their lives. What they did and who they married was set by custom and law in nearly every agricultural society. Custom and law administrated first and foremost by their fathers, and then a succession of officials and authorities who all had one thing in common. They were men. There can be no argument that the plight of women under the lamp of enlightenment and humanism desperately needed improvement. Even while men of good character fought to end slavery, their wives and daughters had fewer rights in some jurisdiction than their slaves. Abuse was rampant. Under the agricultural religion Christianity, women were regulated to permanent second-class status, thanks to holy writing by another agricultural civilization centuries before, by men. After World War II, the men who brought you the Blitz, the ovens, and radioactive fallout were just as easy to blame for the problems in the American family. The patriarchal father figure, the one who told everyone what to do and uses his unearned and unelected power and authority at whim, became the focus of feminist attention from the beginning of the movement. Worse, they seemed to be suppressing the birth control pill, which allowed women stop fearing pregnancy when they had sex with their husbands or anyone else. That made feminists pro-sex and anti-patriarchy back in the formative years. Interesting fact, when there are a lot of young pro-sex young women around eager to try out their new pregnancy-resistant vaginas, a lot of dudes will go along with just about anything that they say. A young man will put up with just about anything if he thinks it's foreplay. And that includes hating the patriarchy they were destined to inherit. Feminists wanted the patriarchy, the old men who were keeping young women from going to Harvard or becoming astronauts or having sex with hot dudes, overthrown forever. Since rule of the fathers, and by extension all men, have produced such horrors in the world, then the only practical solution was to take the political and economic power away from them and put it in the hands of sensible women. That included liberalization of divorce laws to keep women from being in a bad marriage. That included a declaration of liberation from sexual stereotypes. They chafed at the unfair assumptions and barbaric approach to sexuality and marriage put forth by the patriarchy. And they kind of had a point. When the Industrial Revolution began, giving individual women financial access and women began to be formally educated, the injustices of the agricultural model of marriage and law began to be challenged in a very vocal manner. Women learned to organize and used that organization skill to affect a number of major cultural landmarks: abolition, temperance and prohibition, public education, women's suffrage. By the time birth control and female professionals became an issue, women had 2 centuries of history of organizing under their belts. So when the patriarchy was vulnerable, and it was in the wake of World War II, they knew how to organize public opinion against the male-dominated society that had oppressed women for so long. And they did it in a big way. By 1970, the central place masculinity enjoyed in our culture was in serious trouble. After Watergate, it was puking its guts out in the gutter while women began to exercise their social and political power in a big way for the first time. And they had help. The counterculture that was challenging the establishment at every turn between 1965 and 1975 was fueled by a healthy dose of feminism, and feminism was absorbing the memes and the rhetoric of the other movements of that era, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the wave of Marxist-oriented social movements. With organization and demonstrations, the women's liberation movement, as it came to be called, was the political embodiment of feminism, which had until then been the near-exclusive province of rich white scholars in all-female northeastern colleges. Feminists rode the wave of protests and activism that led to the cultural climax, the Watergate hearings, and the withdrawal from Vietnam. The patriarchy was reeling, but the archetypical patriarch didn't even realize that was happening yet. While Dad was trying to keep the last vestiges of his traditional family together and conserve what power he had left, the women in his life had reduced him to an imperialist oppressor, not a loving head of the family. They took attempts to order the household and the country as domineering attempts to control their destinies. And, worst of all, they worked diligently to place the whole concept of the patriarch, the father as the head of the family, in terminal disrepute. Feminism denigrated masculinity by attacking its core precepts. Competition for one. Feminism has never thought well about the male desire to compete and achieve, or when it has been to the purpose of subverting it. The problem is that men and women think very differently about gender and competition, and those differences, whether you consider them biologically innate or socially taught, led to accusations of skullduggery and sexism when it's usually just dudes wanting to be dudes. And when dudes are being dudes, competing and achieving and such, they just don't like including women, because it's just not fair. To illustrate this point, I'll tell you about a group of car salesmen for a big dealership I used to write advertising copy for, all of whom were in a heated sales contest. Among them was one very beautiful, very savvy woman who was adept at sales. She tried to compete on the same level as her male co-workers, and she did a fantastic job of hitting the numbers. She looked dynamite, and she was really good at convincing aging D4Cs to invest in expensive sports cars for some odd reason. She frequently received awards, bonuses, and recognition by management. But when it came to figuring out the competition casually amongst themselves, the female sales exec's achievements were never seriously considered alongside her male colleagues in their discussions. On paper, there was nothing to separate her accomplishments from that of her male counterparts. They all played well together. They all maintained a highly professional demeanor. There was, to my knowledge, no hanky-panky or personal vendettas. She never slept with her clients. But when the male staff got together at the end of the day to compare notes, the female saleswoman's numbers for the day were irrelevant to the discussion. It perplexed her. She was doing everything she could to make herself one of the boys, and she was as successful as a beautiful alpha female could be. Yet she could not entice them into taking the same friendly wagers and trash-talking banter they enjoyed with each other, and that got her frustrated. Frustrated enough so that she took it up with her boss, who called a meeting of everyone to figure out what was going on. What emerged from that meeting was that it didn't matter what the young woman did, what kind of numbers she put up. The fact of the matter was that the sales competition from the men's perspective was between men. She could get the highest numbers every month for a year, but when you asked any of the guys who among them was the best in sales, they invariably chose a male. Why? Institutionalized sexism? That's the typically feminist answer. That's the answer the feminists are hoping you'll take away. That the men were purposefully excluding the young woman in a mean-spirited and sexist attempt to undermine her credibility. The feminist answer is to penalize the men and give the women advantage over them, simply because the perception of sexism is there. Indeed, that's what the management tried to do in that case. After-work meetings between co-workers in public places were prohibited, as were all male gatherings. She figured that would take care of it. The guys just started hanging out at one of their houses after work and stopped inviting the woman. She went from being tolerated to being ostracized, regardless of her performance. The simple fact of the matter, however, wasn't that the men were trying to be sexist. They were merely competing among themselves. Even when they were faced with a competitive female coworker and one who could easily challenge them at their work, she wasn't included in the competition, because when men compete, it is a matter of sexual selection, not merely a desire to be the best. That's one reason competitive endeavors are so often the target of feminists. When men compete with other men, they don't like to include women. Even when they do, they'll find a way around it. So for feminism, competition is a negative, as it hurts women even if it's absolutely vital for the healthy sexuality of the men. Women often mistake this competitive tendency for blatant sexism. The fact is that we consider measuring ourselves against women to be pointless. We aren't competing with women to display our high sex value. We're trying to attract women with our high sex value, and confusing the two does us both a disservice. Men work better competitively. Women work better cooperatively. There are notable exceptions on both sides, but that's the way things tend to work. Only feminism refuses to acknowledge the value of competition. Aggression is another area where feminists frequently butt heads with men. From a feminist perspective, all aggression is bad, and all those who perpetrate aggression are likewise bad. Aggression implies violence, which implies a victim, and the victim is usually female. Therefore, aggression is a bad thing, because it's bad for women. Of course, aggression is one of the many hallmarks of masculinity, and one we're pretty good at, despite our mothers' best efforts to dissuade us. Men need to be aggressive. We need to be competitive. It doesn't matter why or whether or not it's stupid, or if someone might get hurt. That's not the issue. The issue is we need to compete. We need to be aggressive. It builds our character and makes us more self-assured as men. Aggression among men does not automatically lead to enmity, as it does among women. A man can get the shit beat out of him by another man, and the two can have drinks afterwards. Women are rarely as sporting. Feminism in the workplace and the public sphere had a dramatic effect. As the demonstrations and the political activism picked up speed, wave after wave of feminist-inspired legislation, covering everything from liberalizing divorce laws to refining the definition of rape to issues of child custody and support, were being passed at the state and national level. This wasn't just about the right to vote, or legal equity and the appropriate legislation to remedy it. Feminism, particularly third-wave gender feminism, made disagreements and discussions about the social roles of men and women into a civil rights issue, framing patriarchs, and really all fatherhood, as the eternal oppressors and women as their eternal victims. While women in America enjoyed a historic level of freedom, independence, and economic security. All manner of women's issues were getting attention, and, most importantly of all, the greater culture was actually seeing women's issues and seeing them as important. Climaxing with Richard Nixon's historic signing of Title IX and the collapse of the ERA a few years later, this was the high watermark for feminist activism. By 1980, American women arguably enjoyed a greater degree of freedom, security, and protection than any women had in any country at any point in history. And they had achieved it as women, for the furtherance of women's issues. Of course, about that time, dudes started looking around in confusion when they realized that the culture was changing, and while women's prospects never looked brighter, suddenly theirs was much, much dimmer. While feminism was looking out for the rights and issues of women as a class, no one was looking out for the rights and issues of men as a class. And that's where the men's rights movement was born.